They called my great-grandfather's 80-year-old dam an eyesore and a safety hazard. Then, while I was away at my daughter's wedding, they sent in the bulldozers. By the time I came home from Autumn's reception, the masterpiece Jeremiah Ironwood built with his bare hands in 1943 was gone, reduced to jagged rubble and muddy chaos. The air stank of diesel, the creek roared wild without its steady gait, and the limestone blocks that had guarded our land for generations lay shattered like gravestones. Standing on her polished deck, champagne glass in hand, was Cordelia Blackthorne, our self-appointed queen of Willowbrook Estates. She watched with smug satisfaction as brown floodwater surged through the broken dam, gurgling straight into the storm drains of her own subdivision. Taped to my mailbox was an HOA notice for $12,000 in unpaid infrastructure fees for a dam that existed before her neighborhood was even a sketch in a developer's notebook. Here's what Cordelia never learned. In her city planner seminars, water always wins. And I'm a retired Army Corps engineer who knows exactly how to help it. Tell me, what would you do if some power-drunk official destroyed the thing your family built with their blood and grit? Leave a comment, tell me where you're watching from, and share your worst HOA nightmare. My name is Ezekiel Ironwood, Zeke to friends who've earned it. I'm the third-generation steward of 15 acres in Missouri that my grandfather Jeremiah wrestled out of wilderness. Back then, men fixed problems with dynamite, grit, and geometry, not bylaws and committees. He built that dam by hand, cutting every limestone block himself, fitting each piece so precisely that no mortar was ever needed. 8 decades later, those same stones still held strong, polished smooth by spring floods and perfumed by wild mint that grew thick along the edges. When Jeremiah passed, I didn't just inherit land. I inherited his stubborn heart and 23 years of my own Army Corps experience. After 3 tours overseas and a medical retirement, I came home to peace. The farmhouse, the oak trees, the frogs at dusk. My daughter Autumn grew up here, barefoot summers, fireflies at night, the kind of childhood you can't buy. Then came the developers. In 1995, Willowbrook Estates sprang up like weeds after a storm. Identical houses, manicured lawns, and people who thought rustic charm came from catalogs. Our creek became their water feature. Our dam, their unsightly obstruction. Most of the new neighbors were polite enough. But every kingdom breeds its tyrant, and ours came from California, armed with a clipboard, a Tesla, and an inflated sense of destiny. Cordelia Blackthorne, former city planning assistant, now 3-term HOA president and full-time menace. She drove a spotless white Tesla, trimmed her hedges with military precision, and smiled like someone doing mental math on your property value. The first shot she fired came 2 months after Autumn's engagement. She appeared on my porch one afternoon, wearing jeans that probably cost more than my monthly pension. "Mr. Ironwood," she said with that tight smile bureaucrats use before ruining your day. "We need to discuss how your property integrates with community standards, integration." Like I was faulty software. "Ma'am," I told her, "this property was here before your community existed." She looked around, unimpressed. "That's precisely the problem." Out came a thick folder, the kind that smells like printer ink and bad intentions. "Your rustic infrastructure poses safety concerns. That dam especially. It creates liability exposure. And frankly, some residents find your lifestyle incompatible with our investment protection goals." Translation: "You don't belong here, old man." Her perfume couldn't quite hide the scent of arrogance. Still, I tried diplomacy, offered regular inspections, even maintenance reports. But Cordelia had that glint in her eye, the kind people get when they've already decided you're the nail and they're the hammer. A week later, Child Protective Services came knocking. Someone had filed an anonymous report claiming my property was unsafe for children, right after I mentioned Autumn's stepkids visiting. It was a stunt, pure and simple. The social worker took one look around, smelled the mint, heard the creak, and apologized for wasting my time. But Cordelia's message was clear. This was war. 3 weeks later came the certified letter, her first official strike. $12,000 in retroactive infrastructure fees. I read it twice, standing in the gravel driveway while diesel fumes from the mail truck still hung in the morning air. The paper crinkled in my hands as the words sank in. According to HOA consultant Brantley Blackthorne, yes, her husband, my dam, was now responsible for downstream management interference and needed remediation assessment. Translation: pay us for something we never built, or we'll destroy it for you. It was absurd. My dam had protected this valley since before their subdivision was poured out of concrete. Their own storm drains were the problem, not my stones. But Cordelia wasn't after logic. She was after legacy. I had 30 days to pay, or they'd take action. They took it, while I was away giving my daughter away at her wedding, and that's how I came. Home, to find 80 years of family history turned to mud. They think it's over, but like I said, water always wins, and this time it has help. But that's where Cordelia Blackthorne made her first fatal misstep. She thought she was dealing with a tired old veteran clinging to family memories. What she didn't realize was that I'm a paranoid retired engineer, the kind who documents everything. My Army Corps days taught me one rule above all: always verify before you trust. So, I did what any methodical man would do. I ran a background check on her so-called expert, Mr. Brantley Blackthorne. A few keystrokes later, I was staring at his professional license profile. Registered in Texas. Practicing hydrology in Missouri. Unlicensed. Unauthorized. Illegal. Back in the Corps, we saw this trick all the time. Consultants playing hopscotch between state lines to dodge oversight. My old sergeant had a saying, "Verify the license before you salute the rank." That bit of wisdom had just saved me 12 grand and handed me a legal wrecking ball. My retaliation wasn't loud, it was surgical. I filed a detailed complaint with the Missouri State Licensing Board for unlicensed practice, demanded a transparent accounting of every so-called improvement fee, and requested public access to the HOA's budget. I did it all in front of 63 residents at the next community meeting. Suddenly, Cordelia's empire of polished lies began to crack like ice in spring thaw. Those late nights in my study smelled of burnt coffee and quiet victory. One simple verification had unraveled months of her legal posturing. The engineer in me appreciated the irony. The smallest data point had just collapsed an entire structure. Predictably, Cordelia didn't take the hit well. Within hours, she fired off passive-aggressive emails about harassment of professional staff and defamatory conduct. She even scheduled a closed-door emergency HOA board session, conveniently barring me since my land wasn't part of the subdivision. Nothing says we're innocent, quite like secrecy and panic, but the leak had already started, and gossip spreads faster than groundwater through broken clay. Longtime residents, people who'd lived here decades before Cordelia's Tesla ever rolled in, started asking questions. Dalton Greystone, a retired history teacher, called me up after the meeting. "Zeke," he said, voice quivering. Between anger and disbelief, "Why are we paying for lawsuits nobody voted on?" Then came Savannah Riverside, the widow on a fixed income. She appeared on my porch holding a stack of HOA invoices, her eyes wide. "I've been paying emergency assessments for something I don't even understand," she said. "And now I find out it's about your dam?" The community was fracturing. The older residents, the ones who remembered handshakes and neighborly decency, were waking up. The newcomers clung to Cordelia's promises of property protection, like passengers clutching deck chairs on a sinking ship. Then the online attacks began. Anonymous neighborhood forum posts warning about a mentally unstable veteran and unsafe water structures. The phrasing was juvenile, a digital smear campaign straight out of a middle school playbook. But I'd been through worse. At least the enemy here used Wi-Fi instead of artillery. Still, every morning when I walked the gravel drive to check my mailbox, the rhythm of my boots reminded me this fight was far from over. The difference now? I had momentum. Cordelia's counter-strike arrived with military precision. A thick envelope stamped with the logo of Peyton and Associates, a local law firm known for representing aggressive HOAs with too much money and too little ethics. The letterhead alone felt like an intimidation tactic. Heavy paper, embossed seal, expensive ink. According to them, my dam presented catastrophic liability exposure to the HOA, and I was ordered to obtain professional liability insurance or face immediate removal action. The whole document reeked of desperation and overpriced cologne. When your fake expert gets disqualified, the next move is predictable. Hire real lawyers to repeat the same nonsense using bigger words. But I've always believed that volume and vocabulary don't equal victory. So while Cordelia's legal cavalry was busy firing threats, I did what engineers do best: document, analyze, adapt. Every letter, every visit, every inspection notice went into labeled binders, color-coded tabs, time-stamped photos, notarized correspondence. I built my case the way Jeremiah once built his dam, one stone at a time. Within weeks, the pressure campaign ramped up. Daily certified letters arrived like clockwork, each one tightening deadlines and doubling threats. County inspectors began random visits, always citing anonymous complaints that mirrored Cordelia's favorite talking points. A local newspaper even received an unsigned letter warning about aging infrastructure risks endangering nearby properties. The writing was so melodramatic it could have been ghost-written by a soap opera intern. Then one night, while sorting through another mountain of paper, I found it. The fatal flaw in her operation. An invoice that didn't add up. Cordelia's mounting legal fees weren't coming out of her own pocket. She was pulling the money directly from emergency HOA assessments. Dalton confirmed it the next morning. He showed up clutching his assessment notice like a battlefield relic. "Zeke," he said, voice trembling with fury, "I've been paying for the demolition of your dam. We all have. When did we vote for that?" We hadn't. Cordelia had been siphoning community funds for her personal crusade. In military terms, we'd call that an abuse of command authority. In civilian terms, it's fraud. That's when I deployed my next weapon, Marlo Chen, environmental law specialist, water rights expert, and a woman who absolutely despised HOA overreach. With her help, I filed Freedom of Information Act requests for every county document tied to my property. Then I began systematically documenting every violation of Missouri's HOA bylaws and sunshine laws. It didn't take long for the truth to surface. Cordelia's HOA had no legal jurisdiction over pre-existing private infrastructure. Every order she'd issued against me carried as much authority as a mall cop writing speeding tickets on a military base. The community's reaction was immediate and explosive. Dalton started showing up to every HOA meeting, armed with spreadsheets and questions that made the board sweat. Savannah began organizing the retirees, her gentle voice suddenly sharp with righteous anger. And before long, my kitchen had turned into a war room. The smell of strong coffee filled the air as neighbors pored over invoices and minutes, realizing they'd been conned. We called ourselves concerned residents. In reality, we were the resistance. A coalition of ordinary people tired of paying for one woman's ego. Cordelia responded exactly how tyrants always do when the mob starts asking questions. She doubled down. A 48-hour emergency abatement order appeared in my mailbox, claiming a new inspection had revealed imminent structural collapse. The timing? The Friday before my daughter's wedding. The order? Immediate demolition. She thought she'd found my breaking point. But what Cordelia didn't understand was that I'd been preparing for this the moment she first stepped onto my porch with her designer boots and fake smile. The morning of the wedding dawned bright and beautiful, golden sunlight spilling over the oaks, the kind of morning that makes you believe in peace. I was adjusting my uniform, ready to give my daughter away, when the rumble started. Engines. Heavy machinery. The shrill hydraulic whine of excavators. I stepped outside, metals catching the morning light, and there they were, demolition crews stationed around the dam like scavengers around a carcass. Cordelia stood front and center, clipboard in hand, her expression the picture of smug triumph. "Emergency safety order," she said, waving the papers like a royal decree. "Immediate risk of collapse. We're protecting the community from your negligence." That was the moment she realized she'd underestimated the wrong engineer. Because while she'd spent months building a paper fortress, I'd been quietly constructing something far more dangerous. A legal minefield with her name written all over it. They'd already set up by the time I got there, machines idling, teeth of steel poised over a lifetime of work. My dress shoes crunched on gravel that would soon be mixed with 80 years of family memory. The excavator operator looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. I couldn't blame him. Telling a crew to rip out someone's heritage while the owner is dressed for his daughter's wedding would test the conscience of anyone who still had one. "Ma'am," I said, keeping my voice steady, though the pressure in my chest felt like a boiler about to burst. "I need to see that emergency order and the inspection report that prompted this." Cordelia's smile had all the warmth of a notarized affidavit. "Community safety comes first, Mr. Ironwood," she said, folding herself into the role she'd created. "Sentiment doesn't excuse hazard." My eye, trained for decades to spot the tiniest discrepancy, landed on the paperwork she waved like a warrant. The inspection date didn't add up. The report she claimed justified immediate demolition had supposedly been performed 3 weeks earlier, but the permit she brandished was an expired county authorization tied to a drainage job from half a year ago. Fraudulent paperwork, badly timed, a careless mistake that made my blood run cold. I didn't whisper it. I announced it. "Everyone, document this," I called out to the cluster of early arriving wedding guests. "Mrs. Blackthorne appears to be destroying private property using forged or irrelevant documents during a family ceremony." Cordelia had chosen the wrong day for theater. The wedding wasn't just a family event that morning. She had inadvertently summoned 150 witnesses, neighbors, friends, and a few town pillars she couldn't buy with her designer wardrobe. Retired Judge Clarence Whitfield and Chaplain Benedict Stone were on the guest list. Men who knew the difference between lawful authority and stage-managed perfidy. Then the claw hit the limestone. The first bite sounded like a monument being unmade. The creek that had flowed gently and predictably since 1943 ripped loose, the water surging uncontrolled, gouging out banks, swallowing years of erosion work and topsoil. What Jeremiah had set in place over months of backbreaking labor vanished in inches of steel and minutes of violence. 2 hours later, the dam was rubble. The ceremony moved to the church basement. Autumn's wedding dress hem spattered with creek mud, and the whole affair had turned into an angry, grainy spectacle for everyone who cared to watch. People don't stand by when a family relic is razed during a celebration. The crowd became an army of witnesses with smartphones, recording every angle, every word. Judge Whitfield cornered me in the hastily reassembled reception, his face carved with the sort of professional disbelief reserved for courtroom betrayals. "Zeke," he said, low and furious, "that was not an emergency demolition. Emergency abatement has procedures. That was either gross incompetence or straight-up fraud with potential federal exposure." Father Benedict did more than pray. He offered connections, contacts with investigative reporters who specialized in government overreach and exposés. "Truth tends to surface," he told me, straightening his collar. "And it's a poor hiding place behind paperwork." The fallout was immediate and merciless. The uncontrolled torrent flooded HOA common areas within hours, turning their manicured walking paths into quagmires that looked less like community green space and more like a scene out of a storm surge documentary. Local news trucks arrived before dusk, footage rolling of a composed HOA president watching destruction from her deck as a white dress tramped through mud. Social media ignited, hashtags burned, and jokes landed like mortar shells. Several board members quietly distanced themselves, claiming they weren't aware of the demolition order. But the real twist came with the morning cleanup. Wind and water had scattered papers everywhere. Soggy documents blew across my property and lodged in grass, under porch steps, and in the crook of an oak. Among the ruined receipts and rain-blurred memos were financial records that should never have been seen, the HOA's ledgers, invoices, and bank statements, some of them torn and water-streaked but legible enough to speak loudly. They were a confession in ink and mud. I spread those damp pages across my kitchen table, the same table where 3 generations of Ironwoods had argued, planned, and solved problems, and read a story that made my stomach turn. It wasn't about safety at all. It was about a slow, methodical siphoning of community funds. The headline figure hit me first. A bank balance showing a negative $847,000. 847 grand wiped out in an account supposedly for neighborhood upkeep. Then the invoices began to tell their own tale. Payments to Blackthorn Landscaping Solutions for $200,000 for work that had never been performed. Charges for maintenance that hadn't happened. Consulting fees that corresponded to no real services. Just paper trails leading to an imaginary company and a real payoff. Line after line mapped out 2 years of fabricated expenses, shell companies, and creative bookkeeping. It read like a mid-budget embezzlement scheme with all the arrogance of someone who thought they'd never be caught. The insurance emails were the clincher. Chain after chain of messages between Cordelia and an adjuster discussed how an upstream structural failure could justify massive payouts for common area flood damage. The design was elegant in its criminal simplicity. Engineer the failure. Blame pre-existing private infrastructure. Trigger insurance claims to replace the funds that had been stolen, and paint the property owner as the irresponsible party. My grandfather's dam wasn't a hazard, it was a scapegoat. She'd been siphoning off assessments and padding her pockets, then fabricating an existential threat to justify emergency spending. It was genius only if you ignore morality, law, and the fact that a Midwestern wedding includes more than 36 people who know how to call a reporter and a judge. In trying to erase my family's work, Cordelia had left a paper trail slick with her own fingerprints. The smell of diesel still lingered in the yard as I pieced the pages together. The flood delivered me the evidence in the most cinematic way possible, wind-blown, water-stained, and impossible to ignore. She'd thought the morning's chaos would bury the truth. Instead, she buried herself in it. The documents were a map straight to criminal exposure, gift-wrapped by her own arrogance and dropped in my lap by the very force she unleashed. The timestamps on Cordelia's emails told the entire story before I even needed to read the rest. She hadn't improvised the insurance fraud after the demolition. She'd planned it weeks in advance. The attachments included staged photos of damaged drainage systems and pre-written reports describing flooding that hadn't yet happened. Her foresight wasn't just criminal, it was pathological. From my years investigating military procurement fraud, I recognized the signature arrogance of someone who thought rules were for lesser mortals. Cordelia operated with the confidence of a person convinced their manicure could outlast federal jurisdiction. The real bombshell came inside a digital folder marked Emergency Reserve Allocations. Within it, bank transfer logs showing hundreds of thousands quietly routed through shell accounts and landing offshore in the Cayman Islands. Because nothing screams local HOA business like laundering neighborhood dues through Caribbean banks normally used by arms dealers. By the time I sat across from Marlo Chen the next morning, the evidence covered her entire mahogany desk like a crime scene of white paper and bad intentions. A veteran environmental attorney with a background in federal litigation, Marlo didn't even bother to hide her disgust. "Zeke," she said, sliding a stack of wire transfer confirmations toward me, "this isn't your typical HOA scam. We're talking about multi-jurisdictional fraud. Wire fraud, mail fraud, insurance fraud, conspiracy, and money laundering. She's cooked every crime in the federal cookbook. The U.S. Attorney's Office will have to flip a coin to decide which division gets to indict her first." That's when I realized the battlefield had shifted entirely. I wasn't just a wronged landowner fighting HOA overreach anymore. I was sitting on evidence that could send Cordelia Blackthorn to prison for half a lifetime. My job wasn't to survive her anymore. My job was to orchestrate her downfall with precision and patience. But timing was everything. Exposing her too soon might give her the chance to shred documents, hide funds, or charter a one-way flight to a country without extradition treaties. The smarter move was to let her keep digging while we built a case so airtight it could survive a hurricane. Judge Whitfield agreed completely. Reviewing the evidence under the soft hum of my kitchen's overhead light, his voice carried the weight of decades on the bench. "This woman's left enough evidence to fill a courtroom wall," he said, "but we can't move until she attempts another transfer. Catch her in motion and you've got intent, not just proof." The irony was almost Shakespearean. Cordelia had destroyed my family's legacy to conceal the fact she was stealing from the very homeowners who worshipped her leadership. She'd weaponized bureaucracy to wage war against the man who actually built the infrastructure she pretended to manage. Soon those same neighbors would be watching their beloved HOA president led away in handcuffs by the very system she'd tried to exploit. Father Benedict summed it up perfectly during one of our late-night planning sessions at my kitchen table. "Evil," he said quietly, setting down his cup of coffee, "always collapses under the weight of its own arrogance. Our only duty is to make sure everyone sees the collapse. That old oak table, the same one where my grandfather had once drawn blueprints for the dam, became our command center. The smell of burnt coffee and cold takeout filled the air, while documents, flash drives, and legal pads covered every inch of surface. What began as a battle for one man's property had evolved into a full-blown federal operation fueled by righteous fury and procedural precision. Marlowe. Chen led the strategy meetings like a general planning a siege. "We hit her on every front," she said, marking diagrams with a pen that moved like a scalpel. "Civil, criminal, environmental, and financial. When the hammer falls, it'll come from 6 directions at once." Our roster of allies was small but lethal. Judge Clarence Whitfield, retired but connected to half the federal circuit, offering access to prosecutors who relished taking down white-collar tyrants. Father Benedict Stone, moral compass, media whisperer, and part-time crisis negotiator with local reporters who loved a scandal dripping in hypocrisy. Marlowe Chen, environmental and corporate law hybrid, fluent in both the language of justice and the fine print of bureaucratic ambushes. Dalton Greystone, our unofficial field operative, a retired teacher whose daily dog walks conveniently passed Cordelia's house 3 times a day. His updates read like espionage dispatches. Package delivery at 10:07. Luxury furniture crate marked Italian marble. Savannah Riverside. Accountant with spreadsheet obsession so advanced the IRS would probably hire her if they weren't terrified of her. She traced every HOA transaction with surgical precision, uncovering more hidden shell accounts by lunch than most auditors find in a month. Preston Ashworth, former HOA board member turned whistleblower, the man who'd kept everything, meeting minutes, vote records, even Cordelia's offhand notes on reallocating emergency funds. His paranoia had finally found purpose. Each member of that group had a reason to bring Cordelia down, but none more personal than me. For us, it wasn't revenge anymore. It was restoration. Marlowe drew up dual strategies. "Phase 1, she said, tapping her pen against a legal pad. "Document every single bylaw violation. Property destruction, unlawful assessment, abuse of authority. Phase 2. File a civil claim to recover damages for the dam's demolition. Phase 3. Feed federal investigators every piece of wire transfer evidence to build the criminal case." I nodded, the military in me recognizing the cadence of coordinated assault. "When the enemy's surrounded," I said, echoing one of my old commanding officers, "you don't let them retreat. You close in." Judge Whitfield's forensic accountant contact dove into the HOA's books like a bloodhound on a scent trail. By the end of the week, he'd confirmed what Savannah suspected. Cordelia had been fabricating maintenance contracts, overbilling consulting projects, and funneling the proceeds into offshore trusts disguised as environmental funds. The FBI's Financial Crimes Division was next on the chain, armed with subpoenas that could peel the paint off Cordelia's perfect facade. Asset freeze requests were drafted. Every luxury car, every hidden account, every business expense, all lined up for seizure. Meanwhile, Father Benedict's journalist connections began circling. One headline draft summed it up perfectly. "Wedding Day Demolition Leads to Federal Probe. HOA. president accused of multi-state fraud. They loved the narrative, a veteran engineer's family legacy destroyed to hide a white-collar crime spree. It was the kind of story that grabbed national attention, and Cordelia's name was about to be trending for all the wrong reasons. Our small-town intelligence network functioned like a covert task force. Dalton's morning jogs documented new contractor visits. Savannah's forensic spreadsheets identified fresh money transfers. Preston fed us insider notes from HOA discussions, each line tightening the noose. The operation had momentum now, steady, unstoppable, and silent. Cordelia had built her empire on manipulation, intimidation, and fraudulent control. What she didn't realize was that she'd just activated a counterforce built on truth, discipline, and fury honed by generations who refused to be erased. And as I reviewed the latest evidence under the soft hum of my desk lamp, one thought crystallized clearer than ever. Cordelia Blackthorne had unleashed the flood. Now she was about to learn that water wasn't the only thing that found cracks. Savannah's forensic tracking bordered on artistry. Every HOA assessment, every expenditure, every odd timing discrepancy mapped across color-coded spreadsheets that could make auditors weep with admiration. Her data work revealed patterns no one else could see, repetitive payment loops, ghost invoices, and maintenance projects that existed only on paper. Meanwhile, Preston's role turned from whistleblower to full-blown field investigator. He snapped covert photos of routine maintenance crews hauling bankers' boxes from HOA offices under the cover of dusk. Those boxes, of course, contained disappearing ledgers, a disappearing act that would soon qualify as obstruction of justice. Our coordination had evolved into something between a small-town resistance movement and a covert intelligence operation. We called it the Neighborhood Alliance, but in truth it operated with the structure of a federal task force. Our communications flowed through encrypted messaging apps, our weekly gatherings disguised as church-bake sales or community wellness coffees. The brilliance of small-town HOA life was that no one ever suspected the church choir. Committee of Organizing and Anti-Corruption sting. Father Benedict turned. Sunday gatherings into subtle civic lessons. Teaching property rights under the guise of community healing. Stewardship, he'd say to a room full of parishioners, isn't just about lawns and fences. It's about honesty and leadership. Residents nodded politely, not realizing they were receiving legal education disguised as scripture. Judge Whitfield led parallel workshops that decoded HOA statutes and liability clauses, exposing just how limited the board's authority actually was. The fog of ignorance began to clear, and with it, Cordelia's power. I spent my days leading flood recovery crews, fixing what her arrogance had broken. But while I worked, I documented everything. Time-stamped photos, drone footage, engineering reports detailing continuing environmental damage. Each image became a tile in the mosaic of accountability we were building. Slowly, fear gave way to unity. Neighbors who'd once deferred to Cordelia's authority began to question her every word. People who'd lived in quiet compliance now stood shoulder to shoulder, realizing they'd all been victims of the same deception. Cordelia, predictably, responded like a cornered animal. Her mansion sprouted security cameras overnight. New fences went up, and she stopped appearing at public functions altogether. When she did communicate, it was through carefully worded statements read by nervous proxies at HOA meetings. But her attempts at control only deepened suspicion. Bank activity confirmed what we suspected. Her offshore transfers were accelerating, the digital equivalent of rats abandoning a sinking yacht. My farmhouse became our headquarters, a hybrid of archive and fortress. The dining room overflowed with labeled file boxes and binders cross-referenced with digital indexes stored at Marlowe's law firm under attorney-client privilege. Every document had its duplicate photographed and cataloged. Evidence too sensitive to risk remained secured in Judge Whitfield's reinforced home safe, logged with chain-of-custody documentation worthy of FBI standards. The rhythm of my printer at midnight became the steady heartbeat of justice in motion. From my years managing Army logistics, I knew that victory came down to process. Documentation wins wars. So we prepared for every front: criminal, civil, environmental, and financial. HOA board members were privately reminded that financial negligence carried personal liability, a detail that had several scrambling to distance themselves from Cordelia's empire. Those same board members quietly began offering cooperation once they realized federal investigators would soon be knocking. The combination of insurance fraud, property destruction, and embezzlement carried enough felony weight to ensure plea deals became inevitable. Our coordination reached critical velocity. The feds were in constant contact with Marlowe and the judge, planning the timing of arrests, subpoenas, and asset freezes. Every day Cordelia stayed free, she deepened her own legal grave. And while she schemed in isolation, our community grew stronger, united by one shared conviction: that we wouldn't let her bury us in lies. The creek still ran wild over what was left of my grandfather's dam. Its water brown with silt, but steady, relentless. Watching that flow each evening reminded me that nature and justice always correct their course, no matter how long the obstruction lasts. The lowest point, in this case, was waiting at the federal courthouse downtown, complete with fluorescent lights and stiff-backed benches. Then came her breaking point. When Cordelia realized her missing financial documents had blown straight into my possession months earlier, she completely unraveled. Panic, as I've learned, is the death of strategy. At 2 a.m, motion sensors flared to life outside my farmhouse. Trail cameras caught her in full color clarity. Cordelia Blackthorne, HOA monarch turned midnight burglar, creeping through my yard in designer athleisure, flashlight trembling in her manicured grip. The footage was almost comedic until you remembered the context. She was committing felonies out of desperation. My cameras caught everything, from her tripping over my garden hose and hissing curses that would make sailors blush, to her rifling through shed drawers like she expected evidence to be sitting neatly labeled for her convenience. The humor faded fast. This was a woman unraveling in real time, one who'd burned through pretense and crossed into criminal lunacy. Her next moves made it official. She unleashed a social media smear campaign so transparent it bordered on parody. Posts about unstable veterans, dangerous behavior, and concern for community safety. She even filed anonymous tips to the VA and local agencies questioning my mental fitness and benefits, none of which survived even basic review. The pettiness was staggering and legally suicidal. Her spiral didn't stop there. She attempted to block my daughter Autumn's marriage record, claiming the ceremony had been fraudulently relocated due to her own demolition. It was bureaucratic absurdity at its finest, a desperate attempt to rewrite her narrative as the victim. And then came the crowning act of irony. Cordelia decided to hire a private investigator to dig up dirt on our coalition, a man named Roland Grimm. He arrived in town politely, introducing himself as an investigator with discretion and professionalism. What Cordelia didn't realize was that Agent Roland Grimm was already on the FBI's Financial Crimes Task Force, the very one compiling the case against her. She had, in her infinite arrogance, literally paid the federal government to investigate herself. When Marlowe received confirmation of Grimm's dual identity, she just leaned back in her chair and whispered, "Divine justice comes with a sense of humor." By then, the tide had turned completely. The same woman who'd once bulldozed my family's history now found herself drowning in the flood she'd unleashed. And as the creek whispered through the rubble behind my house, I couldn't help but think. Sometimes the water doesn't just find its way. Sometimes it brings everything down with it. My counterattack unfolded with cold precision, the kind of meticulous documentation that pushes already unstable offenders straight into chaos. Every act of harassment, no matter how small, was logged, photographed, time-stamped, and submitted through the proper legal channels. The trail camera footage capturing Cordelia's midnight break-in made its way to both local authorities and federal agents. Her online meltdowns were preserved like relics in a museum of self-destruction, a permanent record of her unraveling sanity on public display. The neighborhood's reaction was immediate and decisive. Residents who had once stayed silent or neutral suddenly began to see what we'd been warning about. A woman so desperate for control, she'd broken into homes and filed fabricated reports against veterans. That kind of behavior doesn't just cross lines, it vaporizes them. Several HOA board members jumped ship overnight, unwilling to risk being caught in the crossfire or charged as accomplices to her escalating misconduct. When local media picked up the story, Cordelia's carefully crafted image disintegrated under the glare of public scrutiny. The nightly news showcased her rants, security footage, and screenshots, turning her into the perfect cautionary tale of suburban power gone mad. HOA President's Breakdown Caught on Camera ran across the evening broadcast, the kind of headline you can't come back from. The bribery attempt came next, and it was almost cinematic in its stupidity. It happened at Murphy's Coffee on Main Street, the kind of cozy spot where baristas know everyone by name. Cordelia slid into the seat across from me, her face painted with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. She placed a white envelope on the table, pushing it toward me as if she were negotiating peace terms. "Mr. Ironwood," she began smoothly, "I think we can settle this misunderstanding. $500,000 for those documents, and we can all move forward." The scent of roasted beans mixed with her expensive perfume, creating a surreal blend of normalcy and corruption. What she didn't know was that Agent Grimm had suggested I carry an audio recorder, a small device that captured every syllable of her confession with crystal clarity. Federal prosecutors would later describe that 15-minute conversation as a self-inflicted indictment. In those short minutes, Cordelia managed to commit bribery, obstruction of justice, and conspiracy to tamper with evidence, all neatly packaged in one doomed coffee meeting. Agent Grimm said later, half-jokingly, that she'd accomplished in a quarter hour what it takes most career criminals years to achieve. Her final act of desperation was an escape plan straight out of a bad movie. She began draining HOA bank accounts, wiring funds overseas, and booking one-way tickets to countries without extradition treaties. She even called for an emergency HOA board meeting to name a temporary successor, hoping to disguise her flight as a leadership transition. Every night, Agent Grimm sent updates that read like the world's most ironic crime novel. Cordelia's so-called escape strategy was practically a training manual for federal prosecution. The feds already had her flight records, her transaction history, and her digital trail, all while she believed she was pulling off some masterful disappearance. My phone buzzed constantly with updates. A new transfer caught. A flight canceled, another account frozen. Each ping felt like a beat in a symphony of justice, every note bringing her closer to the end she'd been sprinting toward. The stack of evidence on my desk grew thicker by the hour, pages layered with the weight of accountability she could no longer outrun. Meanwhile, Cordelia's public meltdown intensified. Her paranoia metastasized into a full-blown propaganda campaign that could only be described as delusional performance art. Overnight, glossy flyers appeared in mailboxes and shop windows across town, stamped with dramatic stock photos of nervous suburban families and headlines that screamed, "Protect our neighborhood from extremists." According to her fever dream version of reality, I was leading a paramilitary coalition of radicalized veterans and disgruntled residents plotting to overthrow the HOA. The absurdity would have been funny if it wasn't. Such a blatant attempt to weaponize fear. Her paranoia had evolved into theater, loud, baseless, and spectacularly self-destructive. But the harder she fought, the faster she sank. Like water eroding the remnants of my grandfather's dam, the truth carved its own path, steady, relentless, and unstoppable. Cordelia had spent months trying to dam up justice with lies and intimidation. Now the current was breaking through, sweeping every fragment of her deceit downstream. And soon, that current would carry her right where it belonged, into the cold, unwelcoming halls of federal justice, where the only thing left for her to manage would be the minutes ticking down on her sentence. The flyers looked like they'd been drafted by someone whose worldview came entirely from apocalyptic thrillers and late-night talk show paranoia. Cordelia announced an urgent community safety meeting, a theatrical spectacle that blended the aesthetics of a political rally with the melodrama of reality television. And, in an irony so rich it bordered on performance art, she chose the flood-damaged community center as her stage, a building still scarred by the destruction she herself had caused. Her security detail consisted of off-duty cops, men who carried themselves with professional calm, but had no idea they were guarding a woman hours away from federal custody. To them, she was just another anxious homeowner facing bad press, not the centerpiece of an FBI operation. The social media campaign that preceded the meeting was a digital circus. Slick graphics, bot-driven shares, and hashtags warning of militant extremists taking over suburban neighborhoods. Someone had poured serious money into the effort. Unfortunately for Cordelia, our town's online community wasn't exactly prime ground for disinformation. Most of them still use Facebook to argue about bake sale profits and local football scores. Her final deception, though, was a work of criminal art. Every dollar she funneled into her offshore escape accounts was being intercepted in real time. Not by hackers or whistleblowers, but by the FBI themselves. Agent Grimm and his team had built a shell corporation so flawlessly fraudulent that Cordelia had been depositing her stolen money straight into a sting operation, effectively funding her own downfall. Each transaction was automatically logged, every message preserved, each communication marked and stored as future evidence. It was like watching a con artist write her own indictment in high definition. While she staged her desperate last act, our coalition worked with surgical precision. The FBI quietly infiltrated the neighborhood, blending in as friendly residents, PTA parents, and retirees attending a community meeting. They carried hidden microphones and sealed arrest warrants, waiting for the moment Cordelia's performance would turn into her personal finale. Local journalists had been tipped off under strict embargo. They knew something historic was about to happen, and their cameras were positioned to capture every second. Judge Whitfield arranged for neutral legal observers to witness the arrest, ensuring the process was airtight. Father Benedict, ever diplomatic, organized a prayer gathering for unity, which in reality doubled as a non-violent buffer and moral support for what was about to unfold. Marlo Chen finalized the last legal filings for asset seizure and restitution, ensuring every cent Cordelia had stolen would return to the community she'd defrauded. The irony was almost cinematic. Cordelia had scheduled her grand propaganda event inside a ruined building she'd helped destroy, financed by embezzled funds, surrounded by victims of her crimes, and flanked by undercover agents she'd unknowingly paid to dismantle her empire. When she arrived, she did it with the flair of a reality TV star making her final episode debut. The rented Bentley gleamed under the streetlights, a car almost certainly bought with HOA funds, allocated for landscaping improvements. She stepped out in an immaculate white suit, her smile stretched tight with the confidence of someone rehearsing delusion as courage. Her security team escorted her like a celebrity entourage, not realizing they were leading their client straight into the waiting arms of federal law enforcement. Inside, the air was thick with damp mildew and tension. 200 residents filled the folding chairs, a mix of anger, curiosity, and disbelief. The room smelled of wet drywall and anxiety, a fitting atmosphere for a woman about to drown in her own lies. News crews adjusted cameras, whispering to producers. Agents pretending to be homeowners murmured into their hidden earpieces. Cordelia began her speech with the gravitas of a political candidate. "Friends and neighbors," she declared, "our community faces an unprecedented danger. Extremists have infiltrated our HOA, spreading lies and threatening the safety and stability of our investments." The PowerPoint behind her flashed images of dangerous individuals, doctored photos of veterans and activists she'd labeled as agitators. Each slide was a masterpiece of manipulation, fear-mongering propaganda crafted to shift blame away from her crimes. Yet as she spoke about protecting property values, the peeling paint and dark water stains on the walls made a silent counter-argument. Longtime residents sat motionless, holding photos of their ruined homes and copies of inflated assessment bills that had funded her theft. Newer families, those still unaware of the full story, glanced nervously around the room, clutching the glossy flyers she'd mailed them earlier that week. My coalition sat front and center, watching calmly as Cordelia delivered her monologue of denial, every word sealing her own fate. Agent Grimm's agents were already in motion. Two near the exits, one pretending to take photos for the local paper, another standing near the back, arms crossed, eyes locked on her. They waited for the precise moment, not a second too early, when her speech would intersect perfectly with federal timing. She continued, her tone rising. These radicals want to destroy what we've built. They want to undermine your security, your property, your families. The sentence cut off as the first agent stepped forward, flashing a badge. The room froze. The click of handcuffs echoed louder than her microphone feedback. The cameras rolled. Cordelia's face drained of color. "This is a mistake," she stammered, voice cracking. "I'm the victim here." But no one moved to defend her. Even the security guards looked stunned, hands hovering near their belts as realization dawned. They'd been guarding a criminal, not a community leader. Judge Whitfield calmly stood, nodding to confirm the warrant's legitimacy. Father Benedict's prayer group began softly humming, an impromptu hymn that somehow made the scene feel both tragic and poetic. The flood-damaged walls reflected the flashing red and blue lights from outside. The children's paintings of the old dam still hung in the back, their bright colors glowing under flickering fluorescent bulbs, a quiet reminder of what the town had once been before Cordelia's greed poisoned it. That night, the Willowbrook Community Center became more than a meeting hall. It became the courtroom where justice finally caught up to arrogance. Cordelia had planned a propaganda triumph, but it ended as a televised confession. The irony was biblical. A woman who built her kingdom on stolen foundations, brought down by the very people she underestimated. The same community she exploited now watched her led away in cuffs, their silence not of shock but of relief. Outside, the creek continued to run, steady and patient, carrying away the last traces of her reign. And for the first time in years, its waters reflected something new, calm, clear, and free. Dalton, Savannah, and Preston sat poised like expert poker players clutching royal flushes, waiting for that perfect, devastating moment to lay down their cards. Judge Whitfield, expression unreadable, stood quietly off to the side, pen moving with the precision of a man documenting history, or evidence for an inevitable courtroom showdown. Cordelia's downfall began 20 minutes into her grand presentation. Confidence had turned to arrogance, and her carefully crafted lies began morphing into open admissions. "I personally authorized the removal of that damn structure," she declared dramatically, gesturing toward slides showing my property. "Because community safety must come before sentimental attachments to obsolete constructions." It was a confession caught by half a dozen cameras and witnessed by 200 people, an admission of property destruction so casual. It stunned even her loyalists. But Cordelia wasn't done digging her own grave. "The HOA holds full authority over all neighborhood properties," she continued, oblivious to the growing horror in the crowd, many of whom owned their homes long before her organization existed. "And we will take legal action against those spreading lies about our financial management." That was my cue. I rose, unhurried, the room falling silent as I reached the microphone. "Mrs. Blackthorne," I began evenly, "thank you for confessing to property destruction, on camera no less, and before 200 witnesses. Now shall we discuss something even more interesting, like the $847,000 in HOA debt you've been concealing?" A pin could have dropped and echoed. "And while we're being transparent," I continued, holding up a folder of water-damaged invoices, "how about the $200,000 stolen from your neighbors through shell companies you secretly control? Should we go over that here or wait for the federal agents in attendance to read you your rights?" Cordelia's complexion shifted through a spectrum of panic and fury. "Those are lies!" she shrieked, composure gone. "Security! Remove these people!" But her guards didn't move. Instead, several individuals in the crowd stood, flashing federal badges that glinted under the fluorescent lights. One of them, Agent Grimm, stepped forward. "Mrs. Cordelia Blackthorne," he said calmly, You're under arrest for wire fraud, mail fraud, embezzlement, money laundering, and conspiracy to commit insurance fraud. The handcuffs snapped shut, loud enough to silence her last protest. The room erupted, cheers, applause, tears from elderly neighbors who'd watched their savings vanish. The live stream caught every second. Within minutes, the clip of an HOA president being arrested mid-speech went viral. By dawn, national news networks were running headlines. HOA president arrested for massive embezzlement during community meeting. The remaining board members resigned before the sun rose, dissolving the HOA completely. Residents voted to form a new, resident-run association based on transparency, accountability, and basic human decency, revolutionary ideas. Apparently, Agent Grimm later told me that Cordelia managed to commit 3 more crimes during her final speech: perjury, obstruction of justice, and making false statements to federal officers. Her greed had been thorough, but so was the justice catching up to her. With overwhelming evidence, Cordelia struck a plea deal: 5 years in federal prison, full asset forfeiture, and $2.1 million in restitution. Investigators uncovered offshore accounts and fake business ledgers that turned the case into a training model for future FBI financial crimes. Every stolen cent was recovered and returned to our neighborhood. My personal settlement for property damage and emotional distress came to $500,000, a poetic reminder that karma sometimes pays in cash, but no amount of money could restore what my grandfather had built, so we rebuilt it ourselves. The dam's restoration became a community mission, a blend of his old limestone craftsmanship and modern engineering, complete with fish ladders, walking trails, and educational signs. Volunteers worked side by side, rebuilding more than just stone. They rebuilt trust. Autumn and her husband moved into the refurbished farmhouse that spring, and when my first grandchild learned to fish in those waters, I realized this story had become something greater than revenge. It had become legacy. The new Willowbrook Neighbors Association thrived. No board tyrants, no secret budgets, just residents making decisions together. Property values soared, but more importantly, so did morale. Cordelia's forfeited funds helped launch the Ironwood Veterans Foundation, a charity for PTSD support and veteran aid. Using her stolen money to help the people she once vilified felt like justice served with poetic symmetry. We opened the Willowbrook Environmental Education Center near the dam, a place where children now learn about engineering, ecology, and civic responsibility. Annual Freedom from HOA festivals became community traditions: food trucks, live bands, and free legal workshops teaching homeowners their rights. Judge Whitfield began hosting monthly seminars on transparency and financial accountability. Father Benedict turned his parish meetings into hubs of civic education. Marlo Chen, our fiery attorney, became a statewide advocate for HOA reform, using our story as a blueprint for justice. Our little rebellion inspired real change. Missouri passed sweeping HOA reform laws, mandatory audits, open meeting requirements, and background checks for board members. Other states followed. The FBI even formed a specialized unit to investigate HOA financial crimes, using our case as a reference, and so, years later, we gathered at the restored dam once more, 4 generations of family, neighbors, and friends. Judge Whitfield officiated Autumn's anniversary renewal ceremony, while Father Benedict blessed the clear, steady waters. The sound of children's laughter carried across the limestone, echoing against the legacy my grandfather had started. In that moment, I understood something powerful. Sometimes the best revenge isn't destruction, it's creation. You don't win by tearing others down. You win by building something better in their place. Standing up to corruption doesn't just save one home, it can save an entire community. If you've ever faced injustice from a power-hungry HOA, tell your story below. You never know. Your courage might help someone else find their voice. Subscribe for more true stories of ordinary people taking down extraordinary corruption. Because justice doesn't belong to the powerful. It belongs to anyone brave enough to document the truth and demand that the flow of fairness never be dammed again. Next week, the city council that tried to seize a family farm and how one farmer used a centuries-old law to turn their land grab into a full-blown federal corruption scandal. The creek runs clear again, proof that, no matter how long it takes, water and justice always find their way home.